20th century, they were hailed as a miracle refrigerant and became the standard. Until that is, we discovered that this new miracle refrigerant ate away at the ozone layer, and not wanting to be fried by our own sun, starting in the 1990s, we began to ban and phase out all CFCs and HCFCs. And the race was on to find a better refrigerant. And this leads us to the Japanese company, Denso, who applied CO2 technology to automobiles after the bans. The Central Research Institute of Electric Power Industry and the Tokyo Electric Power Company saw the potential for more, and they asked Denso to develop a prototype CO2 air conditioner. And since Japan is an island without many resources, the resource-efficient, quick water heating design quickly found a home in heat pumps and water heaters throughout the country. In the early 2000s, companies like Nihon Atomic developed CO2 tech for commercial and industrial use, and the model quickly spread to East Asia, Australia, and Europe. It's only been within the last few years that the Americas started to notice CO2 heat pumps and water heaters. So how do these things actually work, and why are they so often comboed with water heaters? I mean, we all love a hot shower, but it seems like a hat and hat, right? Well, recall that by using a series of compressors, we can manipulate the pressure on a refrigerant, allowing it to pick up heat and then drop it as needed. CO2 is easy to pressurize and is really good at absorbing heat, which makes the heat pump's job easier. Combine that with water and you're building a great synergistic relationship. Water, of course, is an excellent coolant. If it's good enough for a nuclear reactor, or more importantly, my sick gaming rig, then it's good enough for CO2. So after dumping its heat into hot water, CO2 is cooled off and ready to keep moving heat around again. CO2 also has some other little bonus benefits. It's relatively cheap and easy to procure, clocking in at just $1 to $2 per pound, whereas most other refrigerants cost $5 to $14 per pound. That's a significant cost savings. Plus, it's non-toxic, odorless, and won't explode. Importantly, it's also not a CFC or HCFC, but leakages, while small and rare, they do happen. So anything safe we can find to replace those ozone eaters is a good thing. I know what you're about to say because I thought it too. If we're worried about CFC refrigerants leaking, aren't we worried about CO2 leaking too? And you're not wrong. Half the point of a heat pump is to save us from burning fossil fuels and releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. And while the amount of CO2 inside a heat pump varies from system to system, it's marginal. CO2 is also far less harmful pound for pound than CFC refrigerants, so leaks aren't really a cause for concern here. But before you get too excited, the small amount of CO2 used in this style of heat pump also means it isn't exactly a viable CO2 sequestration method. So how do CO2 heat pumps compare to their standard cousins? It's chemistry and physics time, but don't worry, I'm not going to go too deep on this. A CO2 heat pump's biggest advantage is that they operate at higher temperatures. Exactly why they can do this is complex and has to do with how CO2 is a transcritical or supercritical refrigerant, meaning it doesn't fully change phase like other refrigerants. Combined with CO2's high specific heat, excellent ability to conduct heat, and how well it flows or its low kinematic viscosity, it's almost ideal for moving heat around as part of a heat pump. Almost. Remember CO2's high temperature and pressure requirements? While helpful, financially speaking, CO2 pumps require more advanced and expensive compressors and pipelines than your average heat pump, even all these years later. The high temperature of CO2 heat pumps can mean they're a little less efficient than their more standard comrades. CO2 heat pumps tend to have a COP just under 3, which is far better than gas heaters, but most other heat pumps, as I mentioned earlier, can hit a COP of 3 or better. Then again, most other heat pumps aren't also heating a thermal battery, and when they're doing both, some calculate CO2 thermal battery hot water combos at a COP as high as 8. Now, why the vast disparity? Well, there's just a lot of variables in play. Local gas and electric prices, the size and shape of your building, ambient air and water temperatures at different times of the day, year. You get the idea. This makes calculating the best bang for your buck, or pump for your penny, very complicated, very fast. This is part of why having a smart system do some of that math and optimization for you could be a huge impactful solution. But that raises a question for me. Couldn't we do this hot water thermal battery combo with just any heat pump, not just CO2? Perhaps, but again, water is very hard to heat, so the extra heat from the CO2 refrigerant really helps with heating hot water versus other common refrigerants. Think of it like a sedan versus an SUV. Technically, both can drive in the city or go off-roading, but the sedan is going to struggle with rough terrain that the SUV wouldn't even notice, while the SUV is a lot less gas efficient in the city setting. So like we often see, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to any problem. The analogy aside, Eco2 claims that the Senko 2 can offer 80% savings over more common electric resistance water heaters, and over 40% over a standard heat pump water heater. And this before we account for Harvest Thermal's Smart Pod. That's impressive, but comes with an installation price of twice what a standard HFC HVAC system would cost a household. And this is partially because installing a CO2 heat pump often means replacing not just your air conditioner, but also your water heater, which further drives up the price and has very specific spatial requirements. I know about that because I've done something similar with a D-superheater in my new home, and its space constraints have caused a lot of problems. And since the initial installation costs are some of the biggest obstacles on the road to heat pump proliferation, I can't just hand wave factors that will further increase the price, even if they will, on a long enough time frame, likely pay for themselves. So will CO2 heat pumps be replacing every other heat pump out there? No. Again, there's no silver bullet here. Will CO2 heat pumps gain more traction in the Americas? I think it comes down to whether or not the extra costs of a CO2 heat pump outweigh its extra savings, which will vary region to region and house to house. But even if CO2 heat pumps prove too pricey for domestic use, there are other niches. 10 major Australian supermarkets are switching to CO2 heat pumps to keep food and people cool in the Aussie heat. Danfoss has taken it a step further, building a supermarket with a smart CO2 heat pump reminiscent of Harvest Thermal system. And they're already in use across a variety of hotels and resorts. In one study, they cut thermal energy consumption by an impressive 60%. Rather than being the one climate control system / water heater to rule them all, we might find CO2 heat pumps to be perfect for that larger scale niche. So ultimately, while it's hard to predict if CO2 heat pumps will take off in the Americas like they have in Europe and East Asia, their advantages mean I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing a lot more of these devices stateside, even if it's not in our homes. If you'd like to learn more about... Something's not right here. One second. Hang on. All right, let's try my new studio in my new house. If you'd like to learn more about the science behind heat pumps and many other concepts I glanced on in this video, there's a fun and easy way to do so. I strongly recommend checking out brilliant.org. They have fantastic interactive courses for math, data science, and more, like the classical mechanics course, which goes into detail on key concepts like the conservations of energy. It's one of the important principles of understanding heat pumps, but recently I've been going through the thinking and code course because I'm trying to brush up on my programming basics. It's really fun seeing how conditional logic and while loops impact the way code is processed. Brilliant has thousands of lessons from AI to electricity and magnetism. They've got something for everyone, and they're adding new lessons every single month. And if you're like me, you're probably very busy and don't think that you have the time to take a course, but Brilliant is built around bite-sized lessons to break down concepts into very understandable parts. You're learning the concepts by applying them through fun and interactive problems yourself. I found this active learning is how I learn best. To try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/undecided or click the link in the description. The first 200 people will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks to Brilliant.
The version of The Hobbit that you probably own is not what Tolkien originally wrote. He made a big change to the text in an important part of the story 14 years after it was published, and that is the version we have today. But what was the change, and why did he make it? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into Tolkien's Legendarium, as well as other great fantasy worlds like A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. If that sounds good, there's a subscribe button in the bottom right of your screen. The Hobbit was published in 1937 and straight away was recognised as a classic tale. It was republished several times in the following years, but the version most of us have read, whether that be in audiobook format, ebooks, or just a good old-fashioned book, is not the same as the version published in 1937 in one very important regard. Within months of The Hobbit's publication and success, the publishers George Allen and Unwin were pushing Tolkien to write a follow-up, and after warning them that he was quite a slow writer, Tolkien dutifully started writing what became The Lord of the Rings that very same year. It would be a labour of love, being 17 years before it was published. And although the idea of the long-awaited party, Bilbo having a birthday party then disappearing and heading out of the Shire again, arrived relatively fully formed in Tolkien's mind, the broader idea of the Lord of the Rings did not. He first thought about perhaps having Bilbo just heading off, having used up all of his treasure from the Hobbit, seeking another adventure, but after a while settled on the idea of using the ring that Bilbo had found in the Hobbit in a more central role. He linked backwards to some of the themes and history he'd been working on for literally decades in the Proto-Silmarillion, and the concept of the One Ring emerged, and the quest to destroy the ring emerged naturally with it. But as he was slowly crafting this into a novel, Tolkien started to discover a problem. He had a wonderful idea for a story that built on both the Hobbit and the wider legendarium, but the more powerful and important Bilbo's ring became in that story, and the more it became that the ring took a hold over people so they don't want to part with it, the less Bilbo's original acquisition of the ring in the Hobbit seems to ring true. Let me explain. In the original published version of the story, Bilbo finds the ring under the Misty Mountains and shortly after engages in the riddle game with Gollum. Gollum suggests the terms for the game. If he wins, he gets to eat Bilbo. If Bilbo wins, Gollum gives him a present. Of course, Bilbo wins by using his famous "what have I got in my pocket" riddle, or non-riddle really. Let's leave how fair that question was to one side for a minute. Gollum accepted it as a question, and Gollum lost on that basis. Gollum isn't happy at losing, but knows better than to cheat the sacred and ancient riddle game. So he sets off back to his island to get the present to give to Bilbo, which was the ring. And he can't find it. Of course he can't, it's in Bilbo's pocket. What has he got in his pockets is. He goes back to Bilbo, very sorry for not having the present, and Bilbo basically says that he will call it even if Gollum shows him the way out, and so Gollum does. The two of them part on reasonably civil grounds, all things considered. Tolkien's problem was that he was now writing a story in which Bilbo's silly little ring wasn't just a present that Gollum might offer up in a game of riddles, it was in fact the One Ring. And after 500 years, there is no way that Gollum would ever consider giving up his precious. Consider this section from that original text. This is obviously Gollum speaking to himself, and I'll spare you my full Gollum impression while reading it. Must we give it the thing, precious? Yes, we must. We must fetch it, precious, and give it the present we promised. If anyone read The Lord of the Rings then came back to this, it just wouldn't make sense. Gollum happily giving up the One Ring. So what was he to do? Of course, he could have just left the original text alone. It was largely a standalone children's story, and most casual readers probably wouldn't be paying enough attention for it to bother them. And those that were paying attention would surely understand that later Tolkien had a better idea for that ring, and we should just look the other way when reading something he wrote years before that idea came to him. These things sometimes happen, but that's not what Tolkien was like. So he redrafted that section. From 1951, all editions of The Hobbit contained a completely new section where the old version of the riddle game had once been. Now, the introduction to this new section remains the same. Bilbo still finds the ring on the floor. Gollum still challenges him to the riddle game, and if Gollum wins, he still gets to eat Bilbo. But instead of offering a present, Gollum offers to show him the way out. Of course, Gollum would never have risked losing the One Ring on a game of riddles, or anything else. It was his precious, as important to him as life itself. So when Bilbo wins, the actual bit with the riddles themselves is largely unchanged. Gollum is then supposed to show him the way out. But Gollum has other plans. He says he has to go and get some things to help them get out, and paddles back to his island to secretly get the ring. He is planning to put the ring on, go invisible, sneak up on Bilbo, and kill him and eat him, regardless of what happened in the riddle game. Sneaky little Gollums is. But the ring is gone. Gollum realizes belatedly what Bilbo must have had in his pockets is. He rushes back to attack him, but Bilbo is now invisible, with the ring having accidentally slipped onto his finger. Gollum wails about his loss for a while, but can't just let the ring go. Deciding that Bilbo had cheated him in the riddle game, he further decides that Bilbo must also have been lying about not knowing the way out. The only way to prevent him from going out that way was therefore to race over to the exit himself and try to beat him there. Of course, Gollum being Gollum, he said all of this out loud, and Bilbo quickly realized that the best idea was just to follow Gollum to the exit, and the rest we know. So Bilbo wasn't given the ring, nor did he win it honestly in a contest. He picked up someone else's property and walked off with it. To be fair, the owner of that property wanted to eat him, but still, the new text paints Bilbo in a lot less heroic light. Hold on to that thought, because we'll come back to it in just a moment. As for Gollum, we see him more corrupted by the ring, willing to go against his word, not willing to give up the ring, more willing to do terrible things to get it back. Gollum is darker and more dangerous, and also more pitiable, and the ring's corruptive influence is shown more clearly. Compare Gollum telling himself that he must give Bilbo the present in the original version with these last words Bilbo hears him say in the new version. Thief, 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 Baggins! We hates it, we hates it, we hates it forever. And with that, the re-entry of Gollum to the story of The Lord of the Rings is set up. Gollum will never give up hunting for the ring. He will be relentlessly seeking Baggins and the ring from that moment on. So that's the change Tolkien made to the text, and any normal writer would have probably left it there. The internal cohesion of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was assured, the character of Gollum and the nature of the ring were established, and perhaps the most attentive of readers might even now be expecting to see Gollum reappear in the sequel. As a complete aside here, whereas Tolkien did in fact make this revised draft relatively early on and sent it to his publishers in 1947, along with a bundle of other minor amendments, he did so largely for their amusement and interest, without imagining they would actually make the change. When 3 years later he was sent a proof copy of the revised Hobbit and found they included it wholesale, he was actually quite taken aback, but accepted that it was much better for the purposes of the still unfinished Lord of the Rings. And changes made, probably every other writer would have left it there, but Tolkien wasn't like other writers, so he went even further. Part of Tolkien's all-immersive writing style was the conceit that Bilbo himself wrote The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, and Tolkien merely translated and published it for today's audience. So could he perhaps devise a reason why the early editions of The Hobbit contain that inaccurate account of what happened? Of course he could. This is Tolkien we're talking about. His solution was ingenious. He decided that the original version of the story that we heard was the lie that Bilbo told himself and others about how he got the One Ring. He tells it to the dwarves in The Hobbit, and evidently later to Gandalf and Frodo and Sam, and he wrote it in the Red Book that would become There and Back Again. In the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, we read this. This account, the old account, Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seems never to have altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently, it still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts, but many copies contain the true account as an alternative, derived no doubt from notes by Frodo or Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old Hobbit himself. It has to be said, Gandalf was sceptical of that story from the start. When Bilbo escapes and finds his way back to the dwarves, they make him tell his tale, which he does, leaving out the bit about the ring. They are all very impressed, but we read this. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess.